and also I'm changing mine to speaker view. So over to you, Mary.
Thanks very much, Ian, and good evening, everybody, and a very special welcome to Reverend Dr. Gary Mason. We're very grateful that he's joining us this evening and greatly looking forward to his talk. Gary is a Methodist minister and directs a conflict organisation based in Belfast called Rethinking Conflict. And prior to this, he was Methodist clergyman in a parish ministry in Belfast for some 27 years. And he played an integral role in the Northern Ireland peace process and established the Skinos Project, which is a world-class urban centre developed in our post-conflict society as a model of coexistence and shared space. And this has been acknowledged as the largest faith-based redevelopment project in Western Europe. Gary facilitated negotiations with paramilitary and government officials in Northern Ireland, and his contribution was formally recognised in this regard by the Queen in 2007. And Rethinking Conflict, founded by Gary in 2015, is still dealing with the unfinished business in the Belfast Agreement. He works with Republican and Loyalist groups across Northern Ireland, Ireland, and the UK, very often behind the scenes. Despite the unfinished business of the Irish peace process, there's still a lot of lessons for those in conflict and emerging from conflict. And Rethinking Conflict has been working extensively in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and many people from both sides in the past 10 years, in fact over 1,000 individuals have been brought, both Palestinian and Israelis have been brought to Ireland to learn the lessons of the peace process here. These have been politicians, NGOs, academics, religious leaders dealing with and participating in learning experience of how demilitarization and conflict resolution occurred in Ireland. And Gary also works across a number of settings in the United States, exploring sectarianism and racism and ways in which the toxic nature of these can be dealt with. He is affiliated to more universities and organizations than there is space to list here. But suffice to say, he has played a pivotal role in events in Northern Ireland and in Ireland across the decades and still continues to do so. So it's my pleasure now to hand over to Gary, and we look forward to your talk, Gary, this evening.
Hey, Marie, thank you for your words of welcome, and colleagues and friends, good to see a few familiar faces there and some I don't know. I see Des, you're smiling there. That's one of those familiar faces there that I've seen. I just want to begin. I was chatting to Ian there. I'm currently working with both Palestinian and Israeli filmmakers at the moment. Looking at a documentary film entitled The Day After. This actually began in March last year when they spent some time in Belfast, primarily looking at the applicability of lessons from the Northern Irish peace process and its relevance to the Middle East. We all know what happened in October last year, and they returned in April. Difficult space. I mean, I grew up as a person very much in that British Protestant Unionist loyalist tradition. I refer to it as Northern Ireland. Some call it the North, some call it the Six Counties. And I often say to colleagues in the Middle East, they also know the power of language in their space. Israelis call it the War of Independence. Palestinians call it the Nakba. Is it Israel? Is it Palestine? Is it the West Bank? Is it Judea or Samaria? I think back as a young boy, really, when British troops first come on our streets in the late 1960s. Interestingly, common wisdom of the day was saying, this will be over by Christmas. And all of us know on this screen tonight, that it didn't officially end until July 31st, 2007. It was the longest continuous deployment in the British Army's history. 37 years. And I don't need to remind this audience that the Brits have fought a hell of a lot of wars. So conflict is not easy to bring to an end. And as we've seen in the last number of weeks, months, now over a year, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict seems to be the really intractable one. Most conflicts really have three components: land, identity, and religion. And to a greater or lesser degree, they were present in the Irish conflict as they are in the Middle East. It's been suggested that many efforts to end the Israeli-Palestinian question have failed due to what some scholars would call a failed or a flawed methodology in pursuing a peace process, where the conflict is dealt with as if it was a very technical problem that could be resolved by a selected and exclusive leadership. I would suggest that that's a very valid criticism, because those kind of strategies fail to address the very complex entanglement of grievance, belief, ideology, which actually characterize the region's context and which are at the root of this conflict. And so I would suggest, as we have this conversation tonight, that in reality, we need a process not identical to the Good Friday Agreement, but what we would define as an inclusive peace process, societal shift, senior, mid-level political leaders, community leaders, religious leaders, civic society, all having a role in communicating the need for a real, difficult action in pursuing peace. If you've watched the movie Oslo on Netflix, it was a very elitist, secretive process, and in many ways was dumped on Palestinian Israeli society without any preparation. As Marie alluded to there, over the last 10 years and really over the last 14 years overall, I've hosted over 1,000 Israelis and Palestinians in Belfast and in Dublin. All shades of politics, political parties, civil servants, academia, NGOs, and religious leaders. Trying to look, are there some things within our space that may have applicability to the Middle East? And I'm not saying the Good Friday Agreement is the blueprint for the Middle East, because it is not the blueprint for the Middle East. But I often say some of the things we got right in our context and some of the things we got wrong. Here's 5 lessons just initially that Israelis and Palestinians say to me when we do our final debrief. One of the first things they say is, you know, Gary, in your context, we have seen that political leadership is essential to achieving peace. So let's rewind the DVD. In our context, the early 1990s, when we had what academics were calling a mutually hurting stalemate, which simply meant the British Army were not going to defeat the IRA. So think of that, one of the top 15 military armies on planet Earth were not going to defeat what was a relatively small terrorist organization, freedom fighters, non-state actors, whatever phrase you want to use. And the loyalist groupings were also not going to defeat the IRA. We had enough weaponry in the island of Ireland to continue this conflict for another 50 years. But political leadership emerged on both sides that believed change was preferable to the status quo, a word that you're continually hearing in the Middle East. The status quo, the status quo. I think October the 7th and subsequent events have shattered the concept that the status quo within the Middle East can be maintained. It really is time for new thinking, and we'll chat about that as we move through tonight. And those political leaders in our space took risks, thoughtful risks, to achieve peace while providing a vision that ensured they maintained the confidence of their grassroots supporters. Now, as you look at the Middle East at the moment, are there many names jumping out on either side that we think would take what I would call, maybe in a religious context, thoughtful, strategic, prophetic risks? I don't think you'll be compiling a long list at the moment, because I'm not in relation to that. The second lesson that Palestinians and Israelis would say to me is, Gary, there definitely was a desire here to break the cycle of violence, to save future generations from the horrors of conflict, and that emerged in both nationalist and unionist communities in our context. So that desire for a better future encouraged leaders to take the risks, face down accusations of betrayal from within their own communities to achieve peace. So you think of the Hume Adams talks, the risk David Irvine took with the Loyalist constituencies, and many, many others, the risks that Adams and McGuinness took in facing down the hard men of the IRA to move this forward into a political strategy. The third thing, I'm kind of always expecting this one, Israelis and Palestinians would say to me, Gary, you're not getting this. We don't trust each other. And I kind of say, a lack of trust between opposing sides is an inevitable feature of building peace. And you cannot use it as a justification for not beginning the process. I remember as a very, very young clergy person in the late 80s being involved in meetings in Conway Mill and Shankill, etc., and realizing that trust never comes at the start of a process. Trust will only develop over time through dialogue and many, many times meeting secretly, meeting commitments, building confidence through concrete actions. The fourth thing we wrestle with is attempts to resolve the conflict through military force were ultimately futile. Israelis would often say to me, we want to feel secure in our own homeland. But as we know in our space, military force did not result in sustainable security for either of our communities. We all know a cycle of violence flourished where each side sought to hurt the other side as much as they hurt you. I knew as a little boy in the 1970s, if I heard the 9 o'clock news of my parents and 2 Catholics were murdered, invariably, by the time I got up for school the next morning, 2 Protestants were murdered. Hurt the other side as much as they hurt you, or to use David Irvine's phrase, returning the serve to the other side. So in our context, security was only achieved when dialogue was prioritized, the actual root causes of the conflict were addressed, by the establishment of new frameworks, political institutions that gave space for each of our communities to peacefully pursue their vision for Northern Ireland. The fifth lesson they learn, I think, is crucial because it involves every single person in this virtual conversation tonight. The role of civic society. Now, people often ask me numerous times when they look at our stop-start system of government and stormont that's been down, 44% since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. And people often ask the question, Gary, why have you people not gone back to war? I mean, 44% of the time you have no political leaders. And I often say quite simply, it's civic society that is the social glue that holds our peace process together. Religious actors, women's groups, business people, academics. And that was one of the keys to the Good Friday Agreement, that civic society's fingerprints were all over the Good Friday Agreement. There was an input from civic society. And I think within the Middle East, that is a role that they are going to have to move down. I mean, we know, George Mitchell's throwaway comment after the Good Friday Agreement was signed was, if you think getting this agreement was difficult, and all us tonight know it was, George Mitchell said implementing it will be even more difficult. So even the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement is taken forever. Let me just shift for a minute to tell you about one project I'm involved in, and then I want to look at the multiplicity of possible solutions that have been suggested, and then we'll open it up for a conversation. I'm involved in a number of projects at the moment, some strong partners in Jerusalem. I have a group arriving from the Middle East this coming weekend of 45 from all different strands of society. But one of the organizations I'm involved in began at Harvard University there in Boston, called Bridging Insights. And I'll tell you the statistic and you'll say, Gary, are you sure you're telling the truth? Because every time I read this, I go, can this actually be accurate? Harvard University researched every project on planet Earth between 1946 right through to 2018. Now, I'm not going to do a kind of ask you to guess how many there were. 356, which is an astonishing figure. I mean, if I had to guess that when this project began, I would have said maybe 50, 60, but not 356. And he researched those in immense detail. 51 of those conflicts, violence has not resurfaced. And in analysing those cases for the next stage of this project, we looked at certain criteria. It had to be a protracted conflict. So it had to last at least 20 years from the first year to the year a comprehensive peace agreement was signed. So that was the first thing. It had to be protracted. The second one, it had to be asymmetric. So all conflicts have a state and non-state actor, conflicts between two states. So that had to be happening. And it had to be ethno-national, where one party was claiming to fight on behalf of one particular ethnic group, one party recruiting from a particular ethnic group, and at least one party receiving the support of at least 50% of a certain ethnic group. And this ended up narrowed down to 6 conflicts. So out of those 51 that have applicability to the Middle East, I'll name them: Guatemala, the Philippines, Bangladesh, Northern Ireland, Angola, and Sudan. So what we're really trying to do there is build a research-driven model for conflict resolution or conflict transformation. There's a Palestinian leg to it. There's also an Israeli leg. And there's a number of folk involved in the UK and also the US in relation to that. There are many superb NGOs in the Middle East. I mean, if you're interested, Google later the Alliance for Middle East Peace. In fact, a Dubliner, John Linden, who's currently living in Paris, good friend, is the overall director of that. It will list at least 140 NGOs, both Palestinian and Israeli, some of them together, that are working extensively on this conflict. And I've definitely noticed over the last 6 years that the strength of what we call the third sector in our Irish context has really, really strengthened within the Israeli-Palestinian theatre. People often ask the question, is this a religious war? Is it about identity? Is it about land? All of those factors, to a greater or lesser degree, are in there. Let me just delve into history just a little, and this is only a snapshot in relation to this. So, 20th century. The question for many world leaders was, how do we divide the former Ottoman territory of Palestine between its Arab and Jewish residents? 1948, as you guys know, the formation of Israel as the first Jewish state ended up in either the War of Independence or the Nakba. And those borders are still disputed as we sit today, as Palestinian Arabs remain without a sovereign state. I mean, there have been numerous suggestions that have been promoted to resolve this conflict. I'm just going to highlight some of them, and then we'll open it up for a conversation. The best known one is probably the two-state solution. I have a close friend in Israel, Gilad Shaar. Politically, he's on the left, Labour Party. He was Israel's chief negotiator at Camp David. I mean, I've done a number of bits and pieces with him over the year. He would favour a two-state solution. I would say quite clearly, I did a seminar in Belfast on the 8th of December for a dialogue group that I chair across the island of Ireland of about 100 different people. And he said quite clearly, Israelis and Palestinians don't get on. We need a divorce. As in any relationship, the two-state solution is a divorce. You go Palestine, we stay Israel. And that's it. So that 1948 United Nations partition plan for Palestine saw 2 sovereign states, 56% of the territory allocated to a Jewish state, the remainder to a Palestinian state, and a special international status for the city of Jerusalem. Arab leadership rejected the proposal, said this is unfair, and the War of Independence, or the Nakba, ensued. Many Palestinians in Israeli territory were expelled, or they fled to the Gaza Strip or to the West Bank. And it's important to hear this because a lot of people don't. I mean, the Middle East now, you're an expert in the Middle East if you watch 3 clips of TikTok or Instagram in one of the most complex situations on planet Earth. So Palestinians fled, exiled the Gaza Strip that was then occupied by Egypt and Jordan. So Gaza was occupied by Egypt. Jordan, who fought against the Israelis in the 1948 war, expelled whatever Israelis were in the West Bank and pushed them into West Jerusalem. So Jordan occupied what we define as the West Bank or Palestine from 1948 to 1967 until the Six-Day War. And those territories formed the main basis for negotiations regarding a future Palestinian state. So the two-state solution, the one we hear the most, the one that the international community primarily says, this is the way forward. What are the arguments then in favor of this? Well, it's endorsed by the United Nations. It's endorsed by most of the international community. A two-state solution can maintain Israel's character as the world's only Jewish state. It can fulfill Palestinian national aspirations with an independent and a sovereign Palestinian state, i.e. the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Now, if it was just as simple as that, I wouldn't be spilling into the next piece of what I need to highlight. What are arguments against the two-state solution or challenges to the two-state solution? Since Israel controlled the West Bank, 67, as you all know, settlements, you know that word well by now, Israel has built settlements there in contravention of UN resolutions. And it actually leaves up to 10% of this hypothetical Palestinian state and territory crisscrossed by Jewish populations and their infrastructure. Israeli settlers also oppose any plan to transfer the land to Palestinian control or dismantle the settlements. Some proposals have suggested compensating Palestinians through land swaps of other Israeli territory. Like Gilad Shir, whom I mentioned, Gilad would say, well, look, in relation to the two-state solution, the settlement blocks around Jerusalem, where, by the way, most of the settlement blocks are, maybe 600,000 Jews living there, that they are part of land swaps, but you would still have to decant up to 100,000 Jewish settlers that are further into the West Bank, some almost on the border of Jordan. Now, if you know Middle East history, they disengaged from Gaza 2006, 2007 under Ariel Sharon. They took out 8,000 Jews from Gaza, and that was a major, major operation. So think 8,000, decanting 100,000, I don't know. So majority, the other challenge is, majority Arab East Jerusalem is envisaged as a capital of a future Palestinian state. Many Israeli leaders have opposed that. They would say that Jerusalem is the eternal and undivided capital of Israel. The two-state solution as well, one of the difficulties is it doesn't directly address the right of return for Palestinians whose families fled or were expelled from what is now Israeli territory between 1948 and 1967. Now, Israelis would argue about that, and they would say, well, Gary, can you tell me, like, any place where people after a war they've fled, they come back? It rarely, if ever, happens. And many Israeli security demands resulting from decades of terrorist attacks inside Israel would say, we can't even comprehend a fully sovereign Palestinian state. That I've just said, the two-state solution, is basically the blueprint for most countries globally and the UN and most thinking academics in relation to that. And I've just alluded to some of the difficulties. The next one is a one-state solution, which is called the national solution. I have a close Jewish friend in England, Matthew Teller. If you're interested, he's actually just published a book on Gaza. I'll text him later and tell him I did a book promotion. But he wrote a book as well recently. In fact, I had him in Belfast for that conference on the 8th of December last year. He's written a book entitled The 9 Quarters of Jerusalem. We just think there's 4, but Matthew delves into 9 quarters of Jerusalem. He's a very, very good writer. It's a book well worth reading. So the one-state solution is defined as a binational solution. Single binational state on the territory of the former British Mandate for Palestine, with equal civil and political rights for all its residents. Now, such an arrangement has been proposed by both Jewish and Arab leaders, even prior to the establishment of Israel, and many academics and activists would favour that. So this so-called one-state solution has been growing more popular, primarily because little progress has been made towards a two-state solution. And the construction of settlements, to many people's mind, has reduced the viability of a possible Palestinian state. So what arguments can we say would be in favour of this one-state binational solution? So keep the phrase binational, because I'm going to come to another one-state solution in a few moments. So many would say, look, this is a pluralistic state. It satisfies the principle of giving full democratic rights to all residents of Israel and Palestine, no privilege for any religion or ethnicity. It wouldn't require dismantling all those settlements. The settlements stay in the West Bank, no population transfers, and Jerusalem is the non-divided capital. It can also open the door to the right of return, which is a demand of the Palestinian Authority in negotiations. By granting citizenship to all Palestinians, they're able to return to their family homes, and if they can't, they get compensation of the property because it's no longer recoverable. So you maybe saying, that sounds pretty good, but like everything, there's the flip side of the coin. So, birth rates. Jews would say due to their higher birth rate, the total of the Arab population would quickly surpass the Jewish population, making us a minority and raising fears of violence towards Jews being a minority. And I don't need to remind this audience with the Holocaust, the history of an organization many of us are involved in, the Christian Church, and its persecution of Jews. I often remind people, it's important to hear this, it was not Hitler that designed the first ghettos. Sadly, it was the Christian Church. In Italy, the first ghettos were established by the church, with the kind of provision that was said, you Jews have no right, singular, to live among us. Secular rulers come along and say, you Jews have no rights, plural, to live among us. And Hitler comes along and says, you Jews have no right to live. So Hitler was not discarding the past. I mean, Hitler was building on the past. And as Hitler said in the 2nd chapter of Mein Kampf, today I believe I'm acting in accordance with the will of the Almighty Creator in defending myself against the Jews. So I think it's important the church, and I know, see my colleague and friend Johnson McMaster, who's worked extensively in the roots of religious sectarianism. I don't need to remind people on this call tonight. I know many young men of my generation who ended up taking a gun in their hand and the Bible in the other as they swore member loyalty to Ulster and to the UK, were inspired by religious actors in our space, using volatile political and religious language. The problem is sometimes, as we all know, when the church gets it wrong. I mean, Jonty and I often used to say we were in the States together, and I remember chatting with Johnson one evening and saying, it was really interesting, Jonty, wasn't it? That, I mean, I was on the Working Party and sectarianism, and it took us over 20 years into a sectarian conflict for the church, through the Irish Council of Churches, to decide to establish a Working Party and religious sectarianism. Surely that should have been one of the first things. So sometimes the church, it's more about protecting the institution. It's that kind of Christendom versus Christianity conversation, which is taking place particularly in the United States at the moment. So moving through this, the one binational state. As we know, Hamas in Gaza It won the last elections in Gaza. Some statistics are showing if there was an election today in the West Bank, Hamas would move into political authority and supersede the PLO and the PA. So there are concerns within a Jewish perspective. Palestinian majority unified state results in a Islamist Sharia law dominated government. The third challenge or argument against the binational state is prominent historians would believe that decades of conflict between Jews and Palestinians render the prospect of peaceful coexistence in a singular state highly unlikely. So I'm now going to give you another one-state solution in case you just thought there was one. So that was the binational. The next one's called the one-state solution, Israel, which simply says there is a one-state solution. This is the right, far right in Israel. Annex the Palestinian territories and remain a Jewish state. So, I mean, there has particular talk there over the last couple of years that at least we should annex Area C within the West Bank or within Palestine. And that plan is often seen really as formalizing Israeli control of the West Bank, supported obviously by the settler movement, as well as those who within a theological context say, we have a biblical claim to all of Palestine because in the realms of time, it belonged to Israel. So all of the West Bank is annexed, leaving Palestinians really with what you would call self-governing enclaves subject to Israeli military control. So what are the arguments in favor of this? Obviously from a right-wing messianic settler perspective. Well, this is the world's only Jewish state. This maximizes our security. There's no population transfers, no land swaps, no settlements will be dismantled, and Jerusalem remains the undivided capital. Palestinian rights, yes, they'll get their political rights as a recognized minority. Some leaders argue within this framework that Jordan already constitutes an Arab state carved out from the British Mandate. So there already is an Arab state in Jordan. The territory between the Jordan River, the river to the sea, phrase you've heard recently and not so recently. So that territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea constitutes a greater Israel, promised to the Jewish people in which Palestinians have no right to statehood. So the arguments against that, one state solution Israel. So remember, one state solution Israel, one state solution binational. So maintaining Israel against it as a Jewish state with a non-Jewish majority may require limiting Palestinian political rights. So it jeopardizes Israel's status as a democracy. Annexation is opposed by most of the international community, violates all the UN resolutions, and critics have said you're going to end up with a model in Palestine that is not dissimilar to apartheid-era South Africa. The other interesting point in this is that it focuses on the West Bank. Gaza is not mentioned. Now, the war may have changed that, where there has been talk of those on the right about annexing northern Gaza. You've probably heard that in the last number of days and weeks. But I think the vast majority of the international community would not want that to happen. One you may not have heard of, most people haven't, is the three-state solution. It surfaced a little bit over the decades. So that is, give the West Bank to Jordan, give the Gaza Strip to Egypt. After all, they had it prior to 67 anyway, so let them take it back. Go back to the pre-1967 status quo, known as the three-state solution, maintain Israel, its current borders, granting Jordanian or Egyptian citizenship to Palestinians. And again, there's obviously a challenge to this. So those in favour would say, well, it maintains Israel as a Jewish state in its 67 borders. It avoids Israeli rule over Palestinian territories. We maintain our Jewish majority. Palestinians will get citizenship rights within Arab states that have a strong relationship with Israel, removing concerns about any potential security threats of a future Palestinian state. So the difficulty with that is Israeli settlements in the West Bank. You give all the West Bank to Jordan, you have 700,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank. Where do they go? How do you divide Jerusalem? doesn't address the right of return for Palestinians. It's also opposed by the international community. And apart from that, probably the most salient point is Egypt and Jordan do not want annexation of current Palestinian territories. Integrating millions of Palestinians is going to create large and economic burdens for these two governments. The last one I want to highlight, I find interesting. If you're asking me where I'm kind of leaving my cards, it's probably in what's doable and realistic, and you may agree or disagree, or maybe you have another solution to it. I think it is either two-state solution or something has come about recently is called two states, one homeland. And that's a movement mostly on the left of Israelis and Palestinians say, yes, we have two independent states, but you can choose to live in either state. So in other words, the demarcation, the green line that runs between Israel and Palestine at the moment is a fluid, flexible border. So this would allow Israeli Jews, Arabs, Palestinians to share the homeland together, equal rights in either of those states. And it's really built around a democracy for all, freedom of movement for all, sovereignty to all, a homeland for all, justice for all, Jerusalem for all. It's really a confederation model and security for all. So look, tomorrow morning, I mean, I can kind of guarantee you, none of you are going to text me and say, Gary, I've come up with a solution. It's one of those solutions. Some of them I just do not favour and they're just completely undoable. But it's going back to the Good Friday Agreement, those principles of political leadership, the futility of violence, building trust, the role of civic society. To my mind, those things are crucial. And I do believe, I mean, I know a lot of the virtual audience tonight are religious people, religious actors like myself. I do believe that religion can have a role to play in this. And I know key leaders on both the Islamic side and the Jewish side who are working night and day to try to actually bring about solutions. If you Google later the Religious Peace Initiative, where I was a colleague, a imam and a rabbi, and I know are working extensively to try to hold a number of the tensions together. But I think for all of us, we need to be honest, having grown up on this island and seeing the destruction of what I define as toxic religion and toxic politics. And I often quote the late chief rabbi to the British Commonwealth, Jonathan Sacks, who sadly died of cancer a few years ago. Sacks has a great book, by the way, entitled Not in My Name. And the underlying thesis of that really is, does the God of Abraham want his disciples to kill one another? It's a heavy read. It's one of those books you'll read a chapter and say, well, I think I need to read those last 3 pages again. But Jonathan Sacks said this. He said in one point, and it is a substantial one, the critics of religion are right. Religion has done harm. It has led to crusades, jihads, inquisitions, and pogroms. It has shed the blood of human sacrifice in the name of high ideals. People have hated in the name of the God of love, practiced cruelty in the name of the God of compassion, waged war in the name of the God of peace, and killed in the name of the God of life. Those are undeniable facts, and they're absolutely terrifying. But it's interesting, the great believers of another generation knew this. I mean, Pascal said, men never do evil so completely and cheerfully as when they do it from a religious conviction. Jonathan Swift, Dean of Christ Church in Dublin, you probably know him better as the author of Gulliver's Travels that many of us read when we were kids. Swift once said, we have just enough religion to make us hate, but not enough religion to make us love one another. And I'm assuming, Jonty, you're in East Belfast tonight like myself, because you're sitting there in front of your bookshelves. A mile from where Johnston and I don't live too far from Jonty, we were sitting, the great C.S. Lewis was born a mile over my shoulder here. And C.S. Lewis said, I think we must fully face the fact that when Christianity does not make a man very much better, invariably it makes him very much worse. And I remember finally, before we open this up for a conversation, speaking at York St. John University several years ago, And a young Japanese professor was lecturing on a topic I knew nothing about and still do not know anything about, on Shinto nationalism within Japan. But she said this quotation, which has stuck with me ever since. She said, "An incomprehensible act becomes comprehensible when told in conjunction with religion." An incomprehensible act becomes comprehensible when told in conjunction with religion. And Johnson, as you know, has spent his life looking at these religious motifs on this island of Ireland, from the Easter Rising to the Ulster Covenant, the kind of God is on my side mentality. And I'm not going to veer in the United States tonight, or we will be up until midnight, in relation to how religion is being used within that context and being debased within that context. I'm a consultant with the Carter Center in Atlanta, just to finish this, and we're not going to go to America tonight. We can do that after the election, maybe. But the Carter Center brought a delegation to Belfast in May of religious leaders and also civic leaders, again, looking at lessons from the Irish peace process. And, I had to say to some of my colleagues, the irony is, you think in the 90s, our politicians, our religious leaders were scurrying back and forward to Washington and New York, asking Americans to get involved to help get us over the line. And here we are, 24 years after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, and an institution like the Carter Center is bringing religious actors and political leaders to the Northern Irish context to learn from our space. And the main thing I guess I was saying to them, just being candid about it, was, as religious actors and civic leaders, you guys really need to bust your gut to make sure you don't spill into a civil war. Because the weaponry in the United States at the moment, I said to them, look, when our conflict broke out here in the late 60s, there were very few guns in the island of Ireland. I mean, shock, of course, we had to go to the United States to get a significant amount of them. But the concern is, if the US spills into conflict, it's a bloodbath overnight. I mean, the weaponry. I mean, I spend 4 months of a year in the States. I'm getting the Sports Authority to buy a new pair of trainers or a T-shirt for training in, and always at the back there is wall to wall of Armalites. This is a sports store, and pistols and glass counters before you. So it's scary. I mean, John, they'd be interested to hear you in this in the conversation. Kirk, our second oldest, when Russia invaded Ukraine, about 4 weeks into it, he texted me, John, and he said, "Dad, is there going to be a third world war?" And for all of us tonight, I was just saying this to a colleague in Australia early this morning at 9 a.m. Never in my wildest dreams would I have believed that one of my kids would actually text me as his dad and say, "Dad, is there going to be a third world war?" But if you follow the press the way I do, I mean, Foreign Affairs, I've subscribed to a magazine. I was reading something, The Economist, there this week as well. Skilled, seasoned commentators are writing, asking the same question. So we're in a very, very precarious place on planet Earth. I mean, most commentators are saying, and they are actually right in my mind, we're in the most dangerous place from the Cold War. So it behoves us, I think, particularly as religious actors, to give leadership. So John T. Marie, I'm not sure what way this is going. I'm just following your lead. So I'm in your capable hands. See where we take it from there.